Horizon just wants to and this is America's aircraft carrier shortage explained by the channel. What you think? There's an aircraft carrier shortage? Okay. If America has aircraft carrier shortage, then I guess everybody else is just thirsty and just starving, I guess. Yeah, America's like a lot of aircraft carriers. But I'm guessing aircraft carrier shortage, assuming what their goal is, I guess, because they're trying to replace it and what is it, like 12 or what is it, like 4 aircraft carrier they're trying to make. I don't know which shortage he's talking about here, but it's going to be interesting. Let's watch it. Remember, if you like my next, don't forget to subscribe so that way I know which videos to react tomorrow. Know what you think is great channel. He talks about interesting topic. That's what I know what you think, right? He usually starts with that. So yeah, this is a surprising one because one thing I can think of America is like the aircraft carrier abundance. That's what they give them, like navy power. I didn't know there's a shortage. So let's watch it.
After the breakout of attacks in the Red Sea in late 2023, the American aircraft carrier USS Eisenhower, nicknamed Ike, was sent to help protect commercial shipping routes. According to the US Navy, it was a historic and unprecedented combat deployment, which included a long list of firsts achieved while engaging Houthis' drone and anti-ship ballistic missiles. In total, the Eisenhower Strike Group launched 155 Standard missiles, 135 Tomahawk missiles, 60 air-to-air missiles, and released 420 air-to-surface weapons. Moreover, Ike's pilots logged over 31,000 flight hours, while they completed over 10,000 sorties. Typically, a carrier deployment lasts around 6 months. But with all the action happening in the Middle East, the US Navy extended Eisenhower's deployment twice. And 9 months later, Ike desperately needed a replacement. But there was a problem. There were no supercarriers available to replace it. You see, the US Navy has 5 aircraft carriers stationed at the East Coast, which typically patrol the Atlantic and the Middle East, and 6 carriers on the West Coast that patrol the Indo-Pacific. The problem was that when the time came for the Eisenhower to be relieved, all the carriers in the East Coast fleet were down for maintenance. As a result, USS Theodore Roosevelt, which was stationed on the West Coast, was chosen to relieve it. But to do so, it had to ditch its original mission of patrolling the Indo-Pacific region, leaving a defensive gap in its wake. But why the US government is allowing foreign companies to purchase American shipyards? How despite having more aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined, the United States is experiencing a carrier shortage, and why even having more ships won't resolve the...
I mean, look, if you're gonna literally patrol the world and gonna have your own scheduling where how it's supposed to be, and obviously for maintenance you're supposed to replace the original one that's there, so basically you have to have 2 for one job. Obviously replacing each other for maintenance. Of course, gonna have like shortages, like the job is too big, like patrolling all those places. So in that way, it's a shortage, sure.
Current carrier shortage issue is not what you think. This is USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest and most technologically advanced carrier ever built by any nation in history. And right now, it's completely unusable. In response to the outbreak of war in Israel, the Gerald R. Ford, while on its maiden voyage, was extended twice, and finally returned to the US in January 2024 after 8 months at sea. Despite being the Navy's deadliest carrier, it's stuck in port and won't be able to set sail until 2025 at the earliest. The reason being that the ship is undergoing maintenance availability, which lasts about a year, during which repairs...
A maintenance of an aircraft carrier is for a year, and what it deployed for 8 months, that numbers don't feel like it. That doesn't add up. That you're going to be deployed for 8 months and like you have to have a year of maintenance, that doesn't feel good. You think like, okay, this aircraft carrier with like a nuclear core at basically as powering them, how submarines are supposed to be there for like months or something, right? Months and years for like long ass things before they needed to come back or something, right? Do you think like aircraft carriers are something similar? Like they could be in sea a long time. That's why they have like nuclear core, so they can be their own thing. They don't rely on anybody else, right? that they can be floating city. But 8 months on sea and then a year of maintenance doesn't feel great, right? There must be more to it than that.
Are made to the ship which cannot be done while at sea. As part of this process, USS Ford is receiving software upgrades, undergoing magnetic calibration in order to reduce vulnerability to sea mines, and receiving other touch-ups prior to our next deployment. Some argue that the main reason the Navy is running short on ships from both the East and West Coasts boils down to not being able to fix the carriers on time. But other factors such as high costs, staff shortages, strained supply chains, and lengthy construction times of new ships also play a huge role. Aircraft carriers are big, like really big, and that means that there are millions and millions of parts on each, from the screws holding up a sailor's tiny bunk bed to nuclear reactors generating power for the entire ship. And all of these require some level of maintenance. When these ships return from overseas voyages, they need anywhere from a few months to an entire year's worth of repairs. And even then, they still don't manage to get everything. During those repairs, the ship cannot be deployed, so it has to sit in whatever bay it was parked at while different crews work to get it back into operational shape again. But this is actually causing some issues, as both the spare parts and the crews to install them have been short for several years now. This has led to what some are calling a carrier shortage. But there are 11 full-size aircraft carriers in the United States Navy, which is more than the rest of the world combined. So how exactly is there a shortage? It's time to learn about the rule of thirds. This rule states that 1/3 of the military forces should always be available for combat, while 1/3 of the force is preparing for combat, while the final 1/3 is recuperating after participating in combat. So in case of the supercarriers, according to the rule of thirds, at any given time, 1/3 of the carrier fleet is deployed, another third is preparing for.
Yeah, so out of the 12, only 4 needs to be there. If you use more than that, you're like breaking that rule.
Or coming off a deployment, and the last third is undergoing maintenance. Since the US Navy has 11 flat tops, according to the rule of thirds, you would expect 3 to 4 carriers to be deployed at any given time. But since currently there are only 2 carriers deployed, USS Theodore Roosevelt and USS Abraham Lincoln, it implies a shortage of deployed carriers. I should note that in case of emergency, it is possible for the US Navy to surge 6 or even 7 flat tops to be deployed at the same time. But
Yeah, I mean, they could just say like, okay, let's take a chance. Like, don't need to have that. Just look at the critical maintenance, like deploy them. If like wartime happens, I'm pretty sure they can deploy all of them. The shortage would disappear. Right now, they're probably being very thorough and going by the book. But yeah, I can see in wartime, they're like, okay, just look at the core elements and everything and just leave it. Just deploy as fast as you can.
it won't happen overnight, as it may take up to 90 days to surge. Surging also means that the standard deck certification cycle would have to be bypassed, and pilots would have to be certified on the go while steaming to the combat area. Now you may ask, wouldn't it be possible to repair all 11 carriers and surge all of them at the same time? The answer to it would be no, because of refueling. While the nuclear-powered American supercarriers have unlimited range, the fuel inside of the reactors only lasts up to 25 years. Once the fuel is consumed, the reactors need to be refueled. This is known as ARCO, or Refueling Complex Overhaul.
I mean, 25 years. I mean, come on, that's a long time.
This is only done once, at the midpoint of a carrier's lifespan, and is the most intense maintenance period any nuclear-powered ship can go through. To prepare for this kind of service, a massive hole is cut into the hull of the ship to allow for easier access to the inside. And everything from the catapult system to water purifiers, air conditioning systems, and even toilets are pulled out and replaced with more modern versions. Even though in the past decades these overhauls took up to 4 years, the Navy is experiencing significant delays with these. After arriving at the Newport News shipbuilding yard to start their ARCO processes, both USS George Washington and USS John C. Stennis were found to have significant damage to their generators, like the one you're seeing right now, that seemed to catch everyone by surprise. These generators take the steam produced by the onboard nuclear power plant and convert it into both mechanical energy and electricity, making them absolutely critical for carrier operations. During the pre-process inspection,
I mean, yeah, obviously, that's how nuclear works. Like basically glorified steam engines, right? Like converting steam into energy. That's how it works. So that's what's happening right now. That kind of like a mid-life maintenance system that lasts 3-4 years. So that's why it's a shortage right now. So for a couple of years, it might still be shortage. It makes sense. So 25 years, that's a good amount, right? Like, but here's what I'm thinking. Like, if all of this makes it more complicated and like just increases maintenance time, and suddenly wartime happens and people get caught off guard, right? By this time, you would start to think like, wouldn't like diesel engines be better because they don't go through this kind of maintenance? But then it's always like pros and cons, and I guess like when it comes to nuclear, cons are not that much, right? Yeah, sure, you have to prepare for things like this, but in the end of the day, it can like power everything, while diesel is going to have diesel issues, right?
the damage was discovered, but the crews were only prepared to perform maintenance on them, not to rebuild them entirely. This led to the USS Washington's ARCO process to take an extra 2 years on top of the already 4-year-long job. Had the delays not been present, it would have been Washington that would have replaced the Roosevelt. But when the time came, it still had several months left of repairs. USS Stennis is facing similar delays, with the damage tacking on additional repairs, meaning that it would take 5.5 years to repair the carrier instead of 4 years. The delays forced the Navy to scramble ships and crews around, with USS Washington sent from South America to the Pacific in order to conduct a hull exchange with USS Ronald Reagan. Hull exchanges are when the crews of the same kind of ship are swapped out, and it allows for a carrier to quickly redeploy, while giving sailors a much-needed break. Hopefully the Washington's crew remembered to give the new guys the Wi-Fi password before they left. But if carriers are so important to American strategy, why not send more workers to help fix them? In World War II, United States Navy sailed over 100 different carriers at once. Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. In the United States, there are only 4 national shipyards that can do these kind of repairs, down from 19 about 50 years ago. Working in these facilities requires a high level of skill and training, and the Navy is struggling.
Yeah, one of the videos, I'm pretty sure Know What You Think video talked about that. It's still surprising me. Like, one of the biggest strength of US is Navy, because what the US is going to fight anyone in America? That's just like what, Canada and Mexico? Most of the power the US needs to project is overseas, so Navy is like instrumental. When it comes to navies, they need aircraft carrier. That's the biggest weapon. So why like down those ports from 19 to 4? That feels kind of like counterintuitive, like a kind of weird, right? So their Navy needs to be strong, right? Their Navy needs to, like, if they go to war against China in Taiwan, they need Navy. If they have to do any war in Europe or anywhere, they need their Navy, right? So that 4 kind of feels like, okay, with everything you have, all the aircraft carrier and other warships, like, is 4 enough?
To replace the older, more experienced crew members as they retire. The new workers they manage to hire lack the experience and generally just work less efficiently. Recently, foreign companies like the Korean Military Naval Company, Hanwha, have purchased former military shipyards in the United States. While it may seem counterintuitive, this is actually being praised by the US Navy, as they're hoping the added international competition will drive domestic companies to improve repair times, or else lose out on the lucrative multi-million-dollar contracts. During the 2020 COVID pandemic, productivity at Navy repair facilities dropped to historic lows, and the builders of new ship components suffered an equal level of setbacks. When you measure carrier repair in years rather than days or weeks, Any kind of delays can cause surprisingly long-lasting issues that are still being felt 4 years later. Depending on which aircraft carrier is being worked on, anywhere between 5 and 15,000 people are required for the job. That's a lot of screws that need tightening. Some of the work is performed by thousands of sailors that call these aircraft carriers home while at sea. But the Navy has struggled to meet recent recruiting goals, and ships like USS Ford have reduced their crew numbers by 500, which
Why were all of them walking, looking down? What was that? Like every single person was looking down and just like walking. It felt depressing. Like, oh, okay, I guess we're going. What was that about?
means maintenance periods will take even longer. Sailors famously dread working in these shipyards though, calling some of the docking ports where carriers are maintained as Satan's pier. Balancing the deployment numbers of aircraft carriers with those in port is no simple task, and it's up to the President and the Secretary of Defense together to decide if sending one is worth the risk and cost. These deployments typically last anywhere between 6 to 9 months, but with a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, they can theoretically go for decades, as long as the ship receives a steady influx of supplies. Just don't expect the sailors on board to be thrilled if you tell them their trip got extended 20 years. But let's say the United States needed more carriers at sea, and cost wasn't.
I'm pretty sure just the way you can resupply through helicopters and shit, I'm pretty sure you can like change squad like that as well. I'm pretty sure they're not gonna be stuck there for 20 years, or like if need be. I'm pretty sure there's like provisions there, like, swap out people after some time.
Isn't an issue. Why not just do less maintenance on the ship and not worry too much if one of the coffee makers is broken? Well, then you'll be in the exact same situation as USS Boxer. After returning from an overseas deployment in 2019, USS Boxer went into overhaul maintenance. But a group in charge of sourcing repair parts decided to cut a few corners to save on costs and time. 3 years later, in 2022, the ship failed sea trials, and it was back to the drawing board for repairs. Finally, 2 years later in 2024, it deployed with the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit for the first time in 5 years, but only lasted 10 days before having to go back after its rudders failed. Currently, the Navy is putting out contracts for more repairs on the ship that could last all.
So that dude basically just said like, oh, it's gonna be fine. Probably got fired completely, right? Like because of him, everything's screwed. So yeah, cutting corner is devastating. There's a saying here, right? Anybody who's in rust, like spin twice or something. I don't know how else to say that. Like, I don't know how it translates, but basically, rushing something is just gonna have to do it twice, basically. So just cutting corner implied now is, like it's constantly coming back for repair for smallest things.
All the way until October 2026, 7 years after its last voyage. So is the United States, with its massive fleet of carriers, actually experiencing a shortage? Or are there just too many missions that need sailing? The answer is a little bit of both. Simply building
Yes,
more
that's the
carriers
answer.
will be unlikely to solve any issues, because at current levels, the Navy has neither the sailors nor the maintainers to keep more ships afloat. It's not that the Navy has too few carriers, they just don't have enough resources to churn out repairs quickly enough. While the Navy cannot control where and when a mission might pop up, they're exploring different ways to react to them. One is the use of allies to cover down on missions. Since 2022, the American Navy has been training on how to have better interoperability with its foreign friends, allowing for other countries to do a bit more of the heavy lifting in policing the world's oceans. The United States allies have begun offering up their own carriers to help cover down on some of the patrol gaps. This isn't a perfect solution, as ships like the Italian Cavour, the Japanese Izumo, and the French De Gaulle are smaller carriers. Most are only large enough to carry helicopters or VTOL aircraft, and only the French carrier Charles de Gaulle is nuclear-powered and has catapults. Ultimately though, having these carriers is better than nothing, but simply asking others for help is boring and won't convince Congress to approve more funding for fancier gear. Because aircraft carriers are the United States' most imposing way of enforcing international diplomacy, it's unlikely that we'll see the numbers of carrier deployments go down anytime soon, unless a lot of countries all decide to relax really fast. Due to the demand rising so quickly, the Navy is speeding up the construction of new carriers to join the fleet. As of 2024, USS John F. Kennedy is 90% complete and will be the second Ford-class carrier in service. USS Enterprise, not that one, is about 35% complete, and its sister ship USS Doris Miller is at 13%. The current US Navy plan calls for 1-for-1 replacement of Nimitz-class carriers with Ford-class flat tops over the next 40 years. The number of aircraft carriers is expected to peak at 12 in the late 2020s as these new ships are put into service and the old ones still have a few years left until retirement. So we'll be able to see if it's actually a numbers issue. For now though, the United States only has its 11 to work with, so they're going to have to make them count.
Okay, so when the life expires, this Nimitz class carrier, are they going to go to scrap? I think it would be better to sell it to allies or something, because allies really sure it will require maintenance, but that's allies' problem, right? It's better to maintain an already made ship than to make it from scratch. So France only has one that's nuclear powered. Everybody else doesn't even have a nuclear powered. So you can give France and everybody else this kind of 11 Nimitz class carriers. They can repair it, maintain it, and they have a better aircraft carrier now, right? And you can afford, it's better than scrapping it, right? But yeah, could you imagine everybody chills out, all war stops, everybody chills out. Look at that, we don't need anything else. I think the funding would drop drastically. They have to manufacture fear or something just to get more orders or some shit. But yeah, that's not happening anytime soon. So yeah, Ford class carriers and shit. Yeah, there you go. There's not much of shortage. It's just logistical issue, let's just say. But yeah, all right. If you like my next subscribe, and I'll see you next time.